The noon sun lay heavy on the land, turning the dust into gold and the air into glass. The stagecoach groaned to a halt before the lone station, its wheels sighing like an old animal settling to rest. From inside, a woman stepped down slowly, steadying herself against the hot iron railing. She was not small, her figure broad, full, clothed in a sky-blue calico dress that seemed to carry the weight of every careful stitch she had sewn by lamplight in some faraway room. She clutched a carpet bag faded at the edges, smelling faintly of lavender and home. For a moment she stood still, letting the sun rest upon her face, as if gathering courage from its warmth. A small knot of townsfolk had gathered, men with their boots hooked on the rail outside the post office, women shading their eyes with gloved hands. One man, squinting from beneath his hat, whispered something to another. It traveled through the group like the lazy curl of smoke from a cook fire. Some chuckled, some glanced away uncomfortably. She heard it, though she kept her chin lifted. The air here seemed different, thinner somehow, and she felt each breath as a choice. The horse appeared before she saw its rider. Hooves struck the packed dirt with an easy rhythm, and then he was there, tall in the saddle, sun-creased face, dark hair just long enough to curl at the edges. His shirt was open at the throat, his belt worn but polished, his confidence worn even shinier. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, but not in welcome. His gaze swept her once, quickly, then away, as if she were a parcel to be inspected and set aside. He spoke low to a pair of grinning ranch hands who had followed him, and though she could not make out every word, the laughter carried clear as a bell. The justice of the peace was waiting inside the station's small office, his wife fussing over a pot of coffee on the back stove. The ceremony was brief, perfunctory, spoken over the scratching of a pen as names were signed in the registry. He did not meet her eyes when he said his vows, his voice smooth but hollow. Her own voice trembled only once, not on the words, "I do," but on his name, strange on her tongue, like a stone she wasn't sure she should swallow. When it was done, he swung into the saddle again, motioning for her to ride pillion. She hesitated only a moment before setting her bag into his waiting hand and climbing up behind him. The smell of leather and sun-warmed wool filled her senses. The land spread out in all directions, oceans of grass rippling under a wind that never seemed to tire. He rode without speaking, his back straight, the horse quick to obey his touch. She watched the sky for signs of change, tracing the thin shadows of hawks across the ground. They stopped once at a stream so the horse could drink. She knelt to cup water in her palms, tasting the mineral bite of it, letting the coolness slide down her throat. He smoked a cigarette without looking at her, flicked the ash into the current, and mounted again before the ripples had settled. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking low, staining the horizon with the color of fresh blood diluted in water. The house stood alone, square and weathered, with a wide porch that seemed to sag from its own weight. She stepped down and followed him inside. The air smelled of stale wood and dust. A wide room held a stone hearth cold from long neglect. One boot scuffed the floor as he pointed toward a narrow hallway. "You'll be in there," he said, and vanished toward the back door. The small bedroom held a bed, a washstand, and a single window looking west. She set her bag down, her hands pausing on the worn leather handle. From somewhere outside came the lowing of cattle and the metallic ring of a gate being closed. The sound reminded her of evenings back home, though there the bells had been church bells, and the air had carried the scent of rain on cobblestones rather than dry sage and dust. She unpacked slowly, laying each garment in the shallow drawer as though setting stones into place for a foundation. A folded letter fell from between two dresses, her sister's handwriting curling across the page. She read it again, tracing each line with her fingertip, hearing the voice in her head, "You deserve kindness. You deserve someone who will see you." She pressed the letter to her chest for a moment before tucking it beneath the pillow. Night came quickly. Through the thin wall, she heard him moving in the other room, the clink of a glass, the heavy exhale of someone leaning back in a chair. She lit the small lamp and sat at the edge of the bed, smoothing the hem of her dress over her knees. The wind outside carried the faint howl of a coyote, a sound that felt both lonely and ancient. She wondered if the land here kept the memories of every voice it had ever heard. Her stomach ached from the long day, but she didn't eat. Instead, she opened the window to let in the night air. The stars here were brighter, sharper, as if carved into the sky with a knife. Somewhere beyond the hills, lightning flickered without sound. She closed her eyes and tried to picture the life she had imagined when she first answered his letter: soft mornings, shared coffee, a steady hand at her back. The picture dissolved like sugar in water. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. She turned her head toward the door, her pulse quickening in the stillness. His shadow passed across the crack beneath it, then moved on. No knock, no word. Just the sound of his boots retreating toward the porch, then the faint thud of the door closing. She sat unmoving until the silence settled deep again. She lay down without undressing, the letter under her pillow like a heartbeat. The bed was harder than she was used to, the pillow thin, but the weariness in her bones was heavier than either. Her thoughts slipped between the day just lived and the days ahead. She imagined the months stretching out, long rides, long silences, the weight of being an answer to a joke told by someone who did not care for the punchline. Yet, as she drifted toward sleep, another thought came, unexpected and stubborn. She had survived harder things than this. A laugh that wasn't cruel, a glance that wasn't dismissive, these were not too much to ask. And if he would not offer them, she would learn to find them elsewhere. The wind shifted, rattling the loose shutter outside her window. She opened her eyes to the darkness, her hand resting over the pillow's secret. Somewhere in the quiet, a truth settled in her chest, warm and immovable. She would not let herself disappear here, not in this house, not on this wide, watching land. And the first person to truly see her would find her ready. She rose before the sky had fully admitted the day, the room still steeped in a kind of blue darkness that clung to corners. The stove resisted her at first, iron belly cold, but she coaxed the fire alive with patient hands, feeding it scraps of kindling until the flames licked upward and the air began to smell faintly of smoke and promise. She measured flour, salt, yeast into a bowl, her fingers moving with the memory of kitchens far away. By the time the first pale light touched the porch, dough was rising beneath a damp cloth, a small act of order in a house that felt like it had forgotten what order was. He did not come into the kitchen. She heard his boots cross the front room, then the back door open and close. The horse snorted outside. A moment later, hooves struck the dirt in a fading rhythm. The sound left the house quieter, lonelier somehow. She ate her breakfast alone at the table, a slice of the previous day's bread and coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on the stove. The day stretched out ahead, work to be done in every direction. Dust had settled in the parlor deep enough to write her name in. She swept until the boards showed their grain again, each stroke of the broom sending motes dancing in the slant of light from the windows. In the larger rooms, unused for years, she wiped cobwebs from the corners, the air dry enough to crackle in her throat. She polished the glass on the mantel until it caught the afternoon sun like a shard of river. At midday, she ventured into town for flour and lard. The general store smelled of leather, tobacco, and dried beans. Two women near the bolt of gingham cloth stopped their talk when she passed. One let her eyes wander over her, slow as a cattleman sizing up a steer, then murmured something that made the other stifle a laugh. She kept her gaze on the counter, reciting her list to the storekeeper as if it were a prayer. Coins clinked onto the wood, the sound sharp and final. She stepped back into the sunlight, feeling the stairs cling like burrs. On the way home, she stopped by the pasture fence where a calf limped awkwardly, its leg caught in a tangle of wire. She climbed through, careful of her skirt, and knelt in the dry grass. The wire bit into her fingers as she worked it loose, but the calf stilled under her voice, low and steady. When it was free, it trotted off a few paces before turning to look back, as if memorizing her. She brushed her palms on her apron and walked the rest of the way with the sun falling warm between her shoulders. That evening, a shadow crossed the kitchen doorway. He stood there, smelling faintly of sweat and whiskey, hat in hand. His eyes flicked toward the loaf cooling on the counter. "Smells good," he said, the words like a man testing water he didn't mean to swim in. Before she could reply, He had stepped out again, the screen door slapping shut behind him. She sat back down at the table, the bread untouched between them. The days folded into one another. She mended tack, her stitches straight and sure. She planted a few rows of beans and corn near the fence, the soil dry but willing. She cleaned the windows until the view stretched clear to the far hills. At night, she wrote letters she didn't send, each one beginning with the same thought, I am still here. One afternoon, a knock came at the back door. An older woman stood there, hair pulled into a silver knot, a basket on her arm. Name's Mabel, she said, stepping in as if invited. Brought you some eggs. Hen's been over generous. Her eyes moved around the kitchen, taking in the scrubbed counters, the flowers in the chipped vase, the bread cooling on a rack. This place looks lived in again, she added, not unkindly. They drank tea together, and Mabel spoke of weather and neighbors, of how the land always repays patience more than haste. When she left, the room felt less empty than it had in weeks. The next time she saw the women from the store, they were standing by the hitching post outside the church. One called out, That husband of yours must eat like a king with you in the kitchen. The other smirked, adding, Shame the king never bothers to come home. She passed them without slowing, the words slipping off her like water over stone, though she felt them sink somewhere deeper later, when the night was quiet. That night, alone in her room, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the wind curl around the house. She thought of the calf, of Mabel's steady eyes, of the way the light had looked on the hills that afternoon. A truth began to shape itself in her mind, quiet but insistent. She had been living as though waiting for someone to grant her permission to matter. The realization startled her more than the loneliness ever had. The next morning, she rose earlier than usual. She baked not just one loaf, but several, setting them on the counter to cool. She chopped vegetables for a stew that would feed more than two. She mended a neighbor's torn coat left on the porch last week, the needle moving like a compass finding north. When she stepped outside, the sky was high and clean, the wind carrying the scent of rain from far off. She walked to the fence line and stood there a long time, looking over the land. It was not hers, but her hands had touched nearly every part of it. By evening, he had still not returned. She set a plate at the table anyway, the bread sliced, the stew steaming. She ate slowly, listening to the clock tick in the next room. When the shadows reached the far wall, she cleared the dishes, washed them, and set them to dry. The house was still. The air smelled of thyme and wood smoke. She went to bed early, the window open to let in the cool. Somewhere in the dark, she heard the distant thud of hooves, the faint clink of a bridle. They stopped outside, but no door opened, no boots crossed the floor. She closed her eyes and felt something in her shift, not a breaking, but the first small movement of something long frozen beginning to thaw. In that quiet, she knew she was no longer waiting for him to come inside. The morning came soft and gold, the kind of light that seemed to rest on everything it touched. She was hanging damp sheets on the line when a shadow fell across the yard. A man was leaning against the fence post, hat in hand, his horse grazing nearby. He was not young, but there was a steadiness in the set of his shoulders, the kind of quiet that comes from a life lived without hurry. "Neighbor," he said with a nod. His voice carried the low, even tone of someone untroubled by silence. He asked if the rancher was home. She shook her head. He nodded again, as if he expected that answer, and explained he'd come to borrow a post-hole digger. She gestured for him to follow, leading him to the shed. He noticed the rows of neatly stacked tools, the swept floor, the careful order she had laid over the place like a quilt. When he took the digger from her hands, he paused, eyes resting briefly on the fine white scar along her wrist. He didn't ask about it, didn't let his gaze linger. "This place smells like home," he said quietly, almost to himself, before leading his horse away. The words stayed with her longer than they had any right to. A week later, he returned the tool. The day was hot, the air thick with the scent of cut hay. She was mending a saddle strap at the porch table, her needle moving in slow, sure arcs. He set the digger down, then, seeing her work, sat on the step without invitation but without intrusion. They spoke of weather, the late rains, the stubborn clay in certain pastures. His words were few, but each carried weight. When he left, she realized she had been smiling without knowing it. The days went on, her routine steady as the swing of the porch door. Yet she found herself noticing the sound of hooves in the distance, wondering if they belonged to him. At the market, she saw him speaking with the storekeeper, a sack of feed at his feet. When one of the rancher's friends made a crude remark about her size, his voice cut in, calm but firm, telling the man he ought to mind his tongue. She hadn't expected the heat that rose in her chest at that moment, or the way her eyes sought his afterward. Later that summer, the church hosted its annual picnic in the meadow beyond the river. She brought biscuits and a jar of blackberry preserves, setting them among the tables. He arrived with a shy-faced girl of perhaps 12, his niece, he explained, whose parents had been taken by fever years before. The girl clung to his arm until she noticed the jar of preserves. Soon she was at the table beside her, spreading jam onto a biscuit and chattering about a foal born last spring. Watching the man and girl together, she saw in him a tenderness that matched the strength in his shoulders. As the afternoon waned, clouds began to gather over the hills. People packed up their baskets, laughter and voices mingling with the rustle of leaves. She stood by the wagon, brushing crumbs from her skirt, when he approached. "Rain's coming," he said. "Let me see you home." It wasn't a question. The ride back was slow, the air heavy with the scent of distant rain. They didn't speak much, but when they reached the gate, he dismounted and walked the rest of the way beside her, leading his horse. She thanked him, and he tipped his hat, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment longer than courtesy required. That evening, she found herself thinking about the way he listened, not the polite, distracted nodding she had grown used to, but the kind of listening that made a person feel as if their words were stones being placed carefully into the foundation of something that might last. The rancher noticed none of this. He came and went as he pleased, the smell of whiskey often following him through the door. His words to her were functional at best, a complaint about the coffee, a reminder to patch a shirt. She began to answer with the same economy, saving her softer tones for the mornings when the neighbor might appear at the fence line. One afternoon, the wind was high and dry, carrying dust that clung to her skin. She was wrestling a loose shutter when a voice called from below. He was there again, offering to help. Together they secured the shutter, his hand steady against the wood, his presence a kind of anchor in the restless wind. When the work was done, he lingered, leaning on the porch rail. He spoke of his ranch, the slow rebuilding after a hard winter, the niece who loved to read by the fire. She told him about the beans sprouting in her garden, the calf that had healed well. The talk was unhurried, without pretense. At one point, he looked at her as though measuring the truth of something only he could see. "You hold this place together," he said. She opened her mouth to answer but found none that would fit. That night, the rancher came home late, stumbling slightly, muttering about a card game gone wrong. He didn't notice the shutter had been repaired, didn't see the way the table was set for two even though he never sat there anymore. She cleared the plates alone, her mind somewhere else entirely, at the fence line, in the sound of a voice that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't realized she missed. The days that followed carried a quiet shift. When she walked into town, she no longer kept her eyes on the ground. She stopped to greet Mabel, accepted an offer of coffee from the storekeeper's wife, exchanged news with the blacksmith's apprentice. Word traveled in the slow, inevitable way it did in small places, that she was the one tending the ranch while its owner drank away his hours. The whispers that once mocked her sighs began to turn into murmurs of respect. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she stood by the porch railing, watching the sky. The air smelled of sage and warm earth. In the distance, she saw a lone rider approaching, the shape familiar in the fading light. Her heart tightened, though she told herself it was only curiosity. He drew up at the gate, tipping his hat. "Fence down in the north pasture," he said. "Could use another pair of hands come morning." She nodded, feeling the corners of her mouth lift. He started to turn his horse, then paused. His gaze lingered a heartbeat longer than it should have, as if he might say something else. But he didn't. When he rode away, she stayed at the railing, the evening deepening around her. Somewhere in the quiet between hoofbeats and the first stars, a thought rose, steady and undeniable. She was no longer only surviving here. Something was beginning to take root, and it would not be easily pulled up. The sky was heavy with the kind of gray that promised either rain or trouble, and Thomas could feel both pressing down on his shoulders. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys, but neither scent warmed him. He stood on the porch, staring out at the uneven dirt road where a lone wagon approached, its wheels groaning as though reluctant to bring what it carried. He knew she was inside, knew from the silhouette in the canvas-covered bed, from the careful way the driver avoided his eyes. The wagon stopped short of the steps. The driver dismounted, boots crunching over the gravel. "She's here," he said, voice low, as if this was a matter best spoken in whispers. Thomas nodded once, jaw tight. He had asked for this, no, bargained for it, and now that she was here, the weight of it settled deep in his chest. She stepped down slowly, her dress faded and wrinkled, the hem dusty from miles of road. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, was pinned back loosely, strands slipping to frame a face that was neither soft nor hardened, but caught somewhere in between. Her eyes, though sharp, cautious, measured him in a heartbeat. She held no trunk, no bundle, just a small leather satchel clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. "You're Thomas," she said, not quite asking. "And you're Claire." They regarded each other for a moment that stretched too long. She was thinner than he'd imagined. He was taller than she'd expected. Both looked older in the light of day than in the words they'd traded before her coming. He gestured toward the open door. "You'd better come inside. Storm's coming." The house swallowed them in its silence. The scent of pine boards and ash from the cold hearth hung in the air. She noticed the worn furniture, the table set with only 2 chairs, the stack of firewood by the wall. No woman's touches, no curtains at the windows, no flowers in jars. It felt like a place that had been waiting too long. "I'll get the fire going," he said, busying himself with the hearth. She set her satchel on the floor, eyes roaming. "You live here alone?" "Not for much longer," he said, and the words felt heavier than he meant them to. She didn't reply, only watched as the fire took to the kindling, the glow catching the planes of his face. He straightened, brushing soot from his hands. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm. I'll show you where you'll be sleeping." The room he led her to was small, a bed pressed against one wall, a quilt folded neatly at the foot. A single window looked out toward the pasture where the fence leaned tiredly. She stepped inside, her fingers brushing the quilt stitching, feeling the faint warmth left from the sun. "This will do," she said. "I'll let you settle in." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "What exactly do you expect of me, Thomas?" The question was direct, stripped of politeness. He met her gaze, unflinching. "I expect you to stay. To help keep this place running. To be here." He didn't say what else, though the unspoken hung between them like the scent of rain before a storm. Her jaw tightened. "And in return? You'll have a roof. Food. Safety." He hesitated. "A place you can belong." Something flickered in her eyes, something like longing, quickly masked. "We'll see." The rain started not long after, drumming steady on the roof. They ate a quiet supper, stew ladled into tin bowls, bread torn by hand. Claire spoke little, and Thomas didn't press. Yet he found himself studying her hands as she ate, small but calloused, the kind that had worked hard. Midway through the meal, a sharp rap sounded on the door. Thomas rose, every muscle stiff. He opened it to find a man standing on the porch, hat dripping, coat dark with rain. His eyes were cold, and they slid past Thomas to fix on Claire. "You didn't tell me she was here," the man said, voice carrying a bite. Thomas shifted, blocking the doorway. "Didn't think it was your business." The man's mouth curled. "Everything in this town's my business." Claire's spoon stilled in the bowl. Her knuckles whitened again, just as they had on the satchel. She spoke without looking up. "What do you want, Harris?" Harris stepped forward, the rain slicking his boots. You know what I want. You think running out here changes that? Thomas's voice was low but edged with steel. She's under my roof now. Harris's gaze hardened. We'll see how long that lasts. He tipped his hat in mock courtesy and turned, boots thudding off the porch into the rain. Thomas shut the door, the sound of it final. Claire still didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the flicker of the fire. He sat again, the stew gone lukewarm between them. Old friend? He asked quietly. Her laugh was humorless. Nothing of the sort. She lifted her spoon again, but her appetite was gone. That night, he lay awake listening to the rain, to the wind rattling the loose shutter, to the faint sound of her pacing in the room down the hall. Every so often, the boards creaked under her step, a restless rhythm he couldn't quiet. He thought of Harris's face, of the way he'd looked at her, and a knot tightened in his chest. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean and sharp. Thomas found her already in the yard, skirts hitched slightly as she scattered feed for the chickens. The early sun caught in her hair, turning it almost gold, but her expression was drawn, her gaze flicking often toward the road. You're up early, he said, stepping down from the porch. Couldn't sleep. She didn't meet his eyes. He took a breath. If Harris comes back. He will. She cut in, voice steady but soft. Men like him always do. There was something final in her tone that made him pause. She tossed the last of the feed and turned to face him fully. You need to know, if you're going to keep me here, you're taking on more than a mouth to feed. You're taking on what follows me. He studied her, seeing now the steel beneath the weariness, the fight buried under all that caution. I can handle it, he said. Her lips curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. I hope you're right. For a heartbeat, the yard was quiet but for the cluck of the hens. Then, far off, the faint sound of hooves on the wet road broke the stillness. Both of them turned toward it, the same thought crossing their minds. She drew a slow breath, fingers tightening at her sides. He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that the space between them felt like a promise and a warning both. The hoofbeats grew louder, more certain, and Thomas knew that whatever they were about to face was coming faster than either of them had time to prepare for. Under the silver wash of moonlight, the prairie seemed endless, an ocean of whispering grass. Lila kept her arms tight around the small boy as the wagon rolled, her fingers absently smoothing the dirt from his hair. Every creak of the wheels felt too loud in the stillness. Samuel sat across from her, hat low over his brow, his hands gripping the reins like the leather was the only thing anchoring him to this earth. Neither spoke. The air between them held the weight of words unsaid, heavy as storm clouds. Far off, a coyote cried, and the boy startled, pressing his face into Lila's shoulder. They had been traveling for hours, keeping off the main road, following Samuel's unspoken instinct to disappear. The boy's uncle, if the man could be called that, hadn't been in sight when they fled, but Lila knew men like him didn't give up their hold easily. She remembered his eyes when he saw her reach for the child, a snake's cold glint, already calculating how to make her pay. That look had stayed with her, tucked behind her ribs, beating like a second heart. She could feel Samuel studying her now, though his gaze was half hidden by the brim of his hat. She noticed the way he measured her strength without words, as if deciding whether she could bear the road ahead. The path narrowed into a dry creek bed, and Samuel slowed the horses. We'll stop soon, he said, voice low, almost reluctant. Lila nodded, though the thought of stopping made her uneasy. Still, she knew the boy needed rest, and she was past the point of feeling her own exhaustion. They made camp under a cottonwood, its branches shivering in the night wind. Samuel worked in silence, building a small fire whose light barely touched the shadows. Lila laid the boy down on her shawl, humming under her breath until his breathing evened. Her voice, soft and wavering, seemed to pull something taut in Samuel's chest. He kept his eyes on the fire, feeding it slow. When the flame steadied, he spoke without looking at her. You didn't have to take him. The words were simple, but they landed heavy. Lila met his gaze then, steady despite the ache in her body. I couldn't leave him, she said. You know that. A muscle in Samuel's jaw worked. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and for a moment, the only sound was the fire's quiet popping. "The man you took him from, he'll follow," he said finally. She nodded. "Then we'll keep ahead of him." It wasn't bravado, just a plain truth spoken by someone who had already decided there was no turning back. Samuel studied her again, and something in his expression shifted, though she couldn't name it. They sat in silence after that, the fire between them like a fragile pact. Hours passed before Lila woke with a start. The fire was low, the boy sleeping soundly beside her. Samuel wasn't there. Panic knifed through her as she scanned the shadows. Then she saw him, standing just beyond the circle of light, looking out over the dark plains. His silhouette was rigid, like he was carved from the same wind-worn stone as the land itself. She rose quietly and stepped to his side. He didn't turn when she joined him. "Riders," he said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Lila's eyes followed the line of his gaze. Far away, faint as a dying ember, a light flickered, then another. "Moving." "How long?" she asked. "Not long enough," he murmured. The boy stirred behind them, his small voice calling for her, and Lila went to him, her hands trembling only once they were wrapped around him again. Samuel doused the fire with a sweep of his boot, plunging them into darkness. "We move now." There was no time to argue. She climbed into the wagon with the boy in her lap, Samuel snapping the reins before she'd even settled. The horses lunged forward, the wheels biting into the earth. The cold air whipped at her face, carrying the smell of dust and sage. Every jolt rattled her bones, but she kept her eyes fixed ahead, as if by sheer will she could make the horizon stretch farther away from whoever was chasing them. For a while, the only sound was the hammering of hooves and the ragged breath of the horses. Lila could almost believe they'd left the danger behind, until Samuel glanced back, his jaw tightening. She didn't need to turn to know the lights were closer now. The boy shifted in her arms, peeking over her shoulder. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice small but certain. Lila smoothed his hair again, the motion more for her own steadiness than his comfort. "Then we hold on," she told him. Samuel steered them toward a stretch of broken terrain where the ground dipped and rose like the swell of a restless sea. The wagon jolted, the wheels threatening to lift, but he kept them moving, threading through narrow passes as if he'd been born to the land. Lila's grip on the boy tightened, her breath catching every time the wagon leaned. Somewhere behind them, a shout rang out, sharp and angry, and Samuel's eyes flashed in the dark. They broke through a low pass into open prairie again, the horizon washed pale by the first hint of dawn. The riders were still there, shadows against the dim light, but farther now. Lila felt a thread of hope tug at her, until Samuel pulled the horses to a sudden halt. "What?" she began, but he raised a hand for silence. Ahead, the land dropped into a wide, dry riverbed, its banks steep and crumbling. Too deep to cross fast. He scanned the edge, searching for a way down. The riders' shouts grew louder, their shapes cutting clearer against the morning sky. Finally, Samuel spotted a slope and guided the horses toward it. The descent was rough, the wagon groaning with each lurch, but they made it to the bottom. The riverbed stretched on, its sand pale and cool beneath the wheels. For a moment it felt like shelter, until a movement caught Lila's eye. Across the riverbed, on the far bank, a figure stood watching. Not one of the riders, someone else entirely. Tall, still, a rifle resting against one shoulder. Even at the distance, Lila could see the glint of the barrel catching the dawn. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as they rattled along the sand. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "We're not alone," he said under his breath. The boy clung tighter to Lila, his small fingers digging into her arm. The riders were closing in from behind, the silent figure ahead, and the riverbed offered nowhere to hide. Lila felt her heart thudding hard enough to ache. She looked at Samuel, and in his face she saw no panic, only calculation, like a man weighing the odds in the last seconds before the first shot. Then, without warning, the figure on the bank lifted a hand and pointed, not at them, but somewhere beyond. A signal. Or a warning. Samuel's voice was barely more than a whisper. Hold on. And before she could ask why, he flicked the reins and turned the horses hard toward the direction the stranger had indicated, the wagon jolting violently as they left the faint safety of the riverbed and plunged into the unknown.